It was a quiet evening in 1942 when the world of the Miller family was torn apart. The air was crisp as three young Native American brothers, full of life and promise, played outside by the river, unaware that the events of this night would change their lives forever. Mark Miller, their father, watched from the window, his heart filled with pride. His three sons, Matthew, Luke, and Sam, were his world. But as dusk fell, a knock at the door shattered that world. Two men stood at the threshold, dressed in official attire. They didn't speak much at first, only handing Mark a set of papers that carried an unmistakable weight. A government order, signed and sealed. "Your sons are to be taken to a school," they said, their voices flat and emotionless. "A government-sponsored institution. They'll be educated there." Mark was stunned. The boys were young, barely old enough to understand what was happening. Matthew was just 16, Luke only 14, and Sam still a child of 12. But that night, their future was decided for them. There was no room for argument. There was no escape. The government was taking them to a school designed to erase their culture, to make them forget who they were, to make them like everyone else. The door closed behind them. Mark's last memory of his sons that night was their faces, their eyes wide with confusion and fear as they were led away into the night. They were taken without warning, without choice. They would never come home. The years that followed were an unrelenting blur of grief and searching. The night his sons were taken was the first chapter in a long journey, one that would stretch out over 35 years, filled with dead ends, empty promises, and countless attempts to find his children. Mark Miller's life became consumed by one singular thought. Where were his sons? For weeks after they were taken, Mark spent his days visiting the government officials, trying to track down any piece of information about his sons. He had no idea where the boys had been sent. The government agents had refused to answer any of his questions, telling him that the children had been relocated for their own good. No more answers came. The phone calls were ignored, the letters left unanswered. The silence was deafening. But Mark didn't stop. He couldn't. He couldn't let go of the hope that one day, somehow, he would find them. His sons weren't gone. They couldn't be. He traveled to different towns, trying to make sense of the bureaucracy that kept their whereabouts hidden. He visited the boarding school, the one the officials had mentioned, but found nothing. The staff at the school claimed they had no records of his sons being enrolled there. They told him that many children had been taken from the reservations, and it wasn't uncommon for records to go missing or be misplaced. They gave him nothing but empty apologies. The isolation was unbearable. Every night, Mark lay awake, his mind racing with questions he couldn't answer. Had they been treated well? Had they been fed? Were they scared, lonely? What did they do to survive in that cold, sterile world they were forced into? How could he have let them go? His heart twisted with guilt, but even so, he refused to accept the silence. His children were out there. They had to be. Months turned into years, and still Mark searched. Each year he went further. He wrote letters to government agencies. He contacted Native advocacy groups. He spoke to anyone who might have information, anyone who had lived through similar experiences. Mark heard stories from other families whose children had been taken, and while their stories gave him some solace, knowing he wasn't alone in his suffering, it also deepened his frustration. It was a system designed to erase their culture, to separate families and communities, and Mark wasn't sure how to fight it. He received a few leads, each one seemingly promising, only to fizzle out. People claimed to have seen his sons, or so they thought. One person even told Mark that his sons had been seen working on a farm in another state. Mark traveled hundreds of miles, only to find the claim was false. He felt like he was chasing shadows. Every answer only led to more questions. Every lead took him further away from the truth. Mark's search began to take a toll on him, physically and emotionally. His body grew older. His hair, once full and dark, turned gray. His back ached from the long hours of walking, searching, questioning. But he couldn't stop. He wouldn't stop. He had no idea how much time had passed. He just knew that he couldn't give up. Not yet. The pain of losing them was one thing, but the thought of never knowing what happened to them, of never being able to find out what had become of his children, was something else entirely. In those years, Mark had lost much. He had lost the connection to the land he loved, to the community he was part of. He had lost the joy of seeing his sons grow into young men, of guiding them, teaching them about the ways of his people. He had lost their laughter, their energy, and their warmth. But the one thing he couldn't lose, the one thing that had kept him going for over 3 decades, was hope. In the winter of 1965, Mark received a strange letter. It came from a former government official, a man who had once worked in the boarding school system. The letter was brief, just a few lines, and it was signed with an anonymous name. The letter read, "I know what happened to your boys. I can't say more. Meet me in 3 days at the old warehouse on Elm Street. Bring no one. The truth is not something that can be spoken in public." Mark's heart skipped a beat. For the first time in decades, there was a flicker of hope. Could this be the answer he had been searching for? Could this stranger hold the key to the mystery? Mark didn't hesitate. He packed his bag and left that evening. He had no idea what he was walking into, but for the first time in 35 years, there was a real possibility that he might finally find his sons, that he might finally have the truth. 3 days later, Mark arrived at the warehouse. It was dark, the sky heavy with the weight of the coming storm. He stood outside the building for a few minutes, unsure of what he was about to encounter. But the feeling that something was about to change filled the air. The man in the letter had given him very little to go on, but Mark had been led to believe that he had the answers. He stepped inside, the creaking of the door echoing in the stillness. The warehouse was empty, the shadows stretched across the room. And then a voice called out from the darkness. "Mark Miller?" the voice asked. Mark's breath caught in his throat as he slowly stepped forward. The voice that echoed through the dimly lit warehouse was low and gravely familiar. For a moment, Mark couldn't place it. He hadn't heard a voice like it in years. But then, slowly, he stepped forward, his heartbeat thundering in his chest. "Mark Miller?" the voice repeated. Mark nodded, his eyes narrowing in the darkness. As his eyes adjusted to the dim surroundings, a figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the dim light of the warehouse. It was a man of medium height, weathered and older, wearing a faded jacket and a worn hat. His face was unshaven, his eyes sharp and filled with a quiet intensity. Mark couldn't quite make out his features, but sensed he had a familiarity that reached deep into his past. "Who are you?" Mark asked, trying to control his voice, which was shaky with anticipation. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped closer, his boots echoing on the old wooden floor. "You're looking for your sons, aren't you?" he asked. His voice carried a slight tremor, almost as if he too carried the burden of the same search. Mark's heart raced. "Yes," he said, his voice firm but trembling with emotion. "Where are they? What happened to them?" The man hesitated before replying. "The story they told you about the boarding school, it's not the whole story, Mark." He stepped further into the light, revealing his face fully. Mark froze. The man was older now, but his features, though worn and time-worn, carried an unmistakable resemblance to one of the officials Mark had met so long ago. This man had been part of the system that took his sons. "I was part of the program," the man said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I was a supervisor at one of the schools where they sent your sons. But I can't tell you what happened in the official records. Those were lies." Mark felt his body stiffen. The lies. They had always known something was off about the government's version of events, but hearing it from someone who had been involved felt like a dagger to the heart. He hadn't been just another victim of bureaucracy. His sons had been part of something much darker. The man continued, "Your sons, they weren't just taken for education. They were used for something else. The system was corrupt, Mark. It wasn't just about education, it was about exploitation." Mark felt his legs weaken. He stumbled backward against the wall of the warehouse, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. He couldn't believe it. After all these years of wondering what had happened to his children, was this the truth? "What do you mean?" Mark forced the words out, his throat tight with emotion. "What happened to my sons?" The man looked over his shoulder as if making sure no one was listening, then stepped closer to Mark. "You don't understand. The children they took weren't just lost. They were sent to government experiments. The boarding school wasn't what they told you. It was a cover-up for something far darker. Your sons were part of a government program to study and manipulate Native children. They were isolated, tracked, and used to measure how quickly they could be forced to assimilate, how much of their culture and identity could be stripped away in the name of civilization." Mark felt the world spinning. His sons, his boys, had been treated like experiments, like objects to be used and discarded. The weight of those words, the gravity of the betrayal, crushed him. He couldn't breathe. "No," Mark whispered, his voice cracking. "They were just children. They were just—" The man nodded gravely. "Yes, they were just children. But it wasn't just your sons. They were doing this to many others, taking children from all over, trying to erase their heritage. And the worst part, Mark, they kept it all hidden. The files were sealed, the truth buried deep, and families like yours were left to suffer in silence." Mark's mind reeled. The years of searching, the heartache of wondering whether his sons had been abused, abandoned, or worse, now felt like a distant nightmare. He had always feared this, but the reality of the situation was more harrowing than he had ever imagined. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together. "So, what happened to them?" Mark's voice was shaky, his hands trembling as he gripped the edges of the wooden table beside him. "Where are they? Are they alive?" The man's expression softened for the first time. "I don't know," he said quietly, "but I do know one thing. Your sons didn't just disappear. The system tried to erase them, but they left behind clues. Clues that can lead you to the truth. They might still be out there." Mark was silent for a long moment, his mind racing. "Where do I start?" he finally asked. "How do I find them?" The man nodded toward the back of the warehouse. "Follow the trail of broken records. There are files, documents hidden from the public. The truth is out there, and it's been buried for decades." Mark knew then that he wasn't just searching for his sons anymore. He was searching for something bigger. He was searching for the truth, not just for his family, but for every family that had been destroyed by this system. "I will find them," Mark said, his voice low but full of determination. "I will bring them home." The man's eyes held his for a long moment. Then he slowly turned and walked out of the warehouse. Mark watched him leave, knowing that this was just the beginning. Mark spent the next few days sorting through the old documents the man had given him. His hands trembled as he read through each page, each file filled with official seals and official language that hid the darkest truths beneath them. What had started as a search for his sons had now evolved into something far larger, something he hadn't anticipated. The documents detailed the government program that had been responsible for taking his children and others like them, a system designed to break down the very essence of Native American culture. The words on the pages were not just bureaucratic jargon, they were evidence of years of abuse, exploitation, and abandonment. It became clear to Mark that this was no accident. His sons hadn't just disappeared, they had been targeted, treated as experiments in a sickening attempt to forcefully assimilate them into a society that never accepted them. As Mark delved deeper, he began to uncover a pattern. Names and dates kept appearing. Officials who had been transferred from one location to another. Documents that had been deliberately lost or misfiled. But the most disturbing revelation was something he hadn't expected. There were more survivors. Other children who had been taken. Children whose families had also been devastated by this same system. Mark's heart sank. The truth wasn't just about his sons. It was about every family who had been affected by these heinous policies. His search had become a fight for justice, not just for his own children, but for an entire generation of Native children who had been robbed of their identities. He needed more information, he needed answers. But the more he uncovered, the more dangerous the situation became. Mark's first real breakthrough came when he traced the name from the photograph back to an old government office in Washington, D.C. There, he uncovered a file, sealed and hidden away from the public eye. This was the file of a man named Edward Ramsey, an official who had worked with the government program during the years his sons were taken. Ramsey's name appeared frequently in the documents, often in connection with the boys' boarding school. Mark felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up as he read through Ramsey's notes. The man had been at the heart of the program, an architect of the policies that had taken his children. According to the documents, Ramsey had been involved in the forcible relocation of dozens of Native children, often moving them without their families' consent and placing them in isolated institutions where their culture was stripped from them. But there was something else. Ramsey's records indicated that at one point he had been reassigned to another location, an isolated government facility in the northern part of the country. Mark's sons had been among those transferred there. Mark's stomach tightened. He knew where he had to go. The journey to the government facility was long and grueling, taking Mark to the farthest reaches of the country. It was an isolated area, far removed from the bustling cities, a place that few people knew about. The facility itself was hidden away in a dense forest, a forgotten part of the system that had been kept off the record. Mark arrived in the small town nearest the facility late one evening, his mind racing. He had spent the last few months chasing down every lead, and now he was finally here. He didn't know what he would find, but he couldn't turn back now. The town was quiet, the streets empty, with only a few streetlights casting long shadows on the sidewalks. Mark went to the local historical society, hoping to gather more information from the old-timers who had lived through the time of his son's disappearance. There, he met a man named George, who had lived in the town his whole life. George was old now, his hair white, his hands shaking with age, but his memories were sharp. Mark told him what he was looking for, and at first the old man didn't want to speak. But after some persuasion, George finally relented, and his words hit Mark like a cold wind. "I remember those boys," George said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "They were good boys, all three of them. But the school, it wasn't what it seemed. We heard things, bad things. People whispered about the children they took, about what was done to them. The stories. They were never good." George paused and looked around as if checking to see if anyone else was listening. "You're not going to like what I'm about to tell you, but there's an old building on the other side of town. It's been closed off for years. But before it was shut down, the government used it for classified experiments. They never told the public about it. But people knew. Mark's heart raced. What kind of experiments? George lowered his voice even further. I don't know exactly, but there were rumors. Rumors that the children who were sent there didn't come back the same. Some of them, they didn't come back at all. Your sons, they might have been part of that. Mark's mind was spinning. He had finally reached the dark heart of the conspiracy. The truth was worse than he had ever imagined. The facility had been more than just a school. It had been a place where children like his sons had been used for government-sanctioned experiments. His sons hadn't just been taken. They had been subjects in something more insidious. The thought of it made Mark's blood boil. As Mark moved toward the old building, he felt the weight of the years pressing down on him. He was about to uncover the final piece of the puzzle, the truth that had eluded him for decades. The answers he had spent a lifetime searching for were within his grasp. But as he approached the building, he realized something else. He wasn't just searching for his sons anymore. He was searching for the truth that would set free all the other children whose lives had been stolen by this system, and he would stop at nothing to find it. The building loomed ahead, its shadow long and ominous under the dim glow of the streetlights. It had been abandoned for years, left to the elements, and the town had long since forgotten about it. But Mark couldn't forget. He couldn't forget the whispered rumors that had led him here. The old building was the final piece in the puzzle that had consumed his life for the past 35 years. Every step he took toward it felt like the weight of the world was pressing down on him, but he had come too far. He couldn't turn back now. Mark stood at the entrance, staring at the rusted door that separated him from the answers he had been searching for. His hand trembled as he reached out to push it open. The door creaked, its hinges protesting with each movement, but it eventually gave way, revealing a dark interior. The smell of mold, dust, and decay hit him immediately, almost overwhelming him, but he pushed forward. The interior was as desolate as the outside, a ghost of its former self. The once pristine walls were now streaked with grime, the floor covered in broken glass and debris. But as Mark stepped further in, he noticed something strange. It felt like the place had been untouched for decades, yet there were signs that someone had recently been here. Faint marks on the floor, a broken chair left in the corner, a flickering light at the far end of the room. His heart raced as he moved deeper into the building, every step bringing him closer to the truth, to the horrifying secrets that had been hidden for so long. Mark followed the dim hallway until he reached a set of rusty metal doors at the end. His breath hitched in his chest. Behind these doors lay what he had been searching for: his sons, the answers, the truth. But Mark knew that once he opened them, there would be no going back. There would be no way to undo the discovery that awaited him. And yet, there was no turning back now. With a deep breath, Mark grabbed the door handle and turned it. The screech of metal filled the room as the door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. Inside, the walls were lined with old filing cabinets, their drawers half open, as though someone had been rifling through them in haste. The air was thick with dust, but Mark's eyes immediately locked onto something that made his heart skip a beat. A set of files lying on the center table, their edges yellowed with age. The files were marked with the names of children, names he recognized. His sons were among them. But the labels weren't what he expected. There were no educational records, no school paperwork. These files were something much darker. He pulled the first file off the stack and opened it carefully. The name on the top read Matthew Miller. Mark's hands shook as he scanned the pages. His heart dropped into his stomach. These weren't educational records. They were medical files, psychological evaluations, and worst of all, there were notes about experimentation. The words jumped off the page, each one more chilling than the last. Subject, Matthew Miller. Age, 16. Assigned to assimilation program. First phase of psychological testing complete. Signs of resistance to cultural assimilation. Further study required. Subject moved to isolated testing facility for extended observation. The room around Mark seemed to close in on him. He had read enough to know that his sons hadn't just been taken to a school. They had been used, manipulated, and subjected to inhumane treatment under the guise of education. But this was something far worse than he had imagined. The files on Luke and Sam were even more disturbing. The same notes, the same experiments, the same reports on psychological resistance and cultural erasure. They were labeled as test subjects, just like the others. The truth was unmistakable now. The government had not just taken his sons for education. They had been part of a sickening program that had destroyed their identities, broken them down, and tried to make them conform to a world that didn't want them. Mark's sons weren't just lost to him. They had been used. Mark slammed the file shut, his mind reeling. He needed answers. He couldn't let this be the end. The files had been part of a larger systematic effort to erase his children's culture. And now, Mark had proof. Proof that his sons hadn't been just victims of a government program, but part of a larger conspiracy designed to break down and erase Native American children. The truth was far more sinister than he ever thought. Mark moved quickly now, grabbing the remaining files. He couldn't stay here long. The walls seemed to close in on him with each passing second. As he shoved the files into his bag, he heard a noise, the faintest sound of footsteps approaching. Someone was coming. Mark's heart pounded in his chest. His mind raced. He needed to get out. The answers were within his grasp, but he couldn't let them slip away now. With one last look at the dark room, he bolted for the exit, his legs carrying him faster than he thought possible. The truth had been uncovered. Mark had found the documents, the files, the proof of everything he had spent years searching for. But it wasn't over, not by a long shot. Outside, Mark stood for a moment, taking in the quiet night air. His mind was still spinning. His sons, Matthew, Luke, and Sam, they hadn't just disappeared. They had been part of something far worse, a government program that had been designed to break their spirits, erase their heritage, and force them to conform. Mark knew now that his search was far from over. The documents in his bag were only the beginning. He would take these files, this evidence, and make sure the world knew the truth. He would bring his sons back, but not just for himself, for all the families whose children had been lost to the system. He had one last task, to bring justice, not just for his family, but for every other child whose life had been destroyed by this horrific program. The night air was cold and crisp, but Mark's blood burned with urgency. His heart hammered in his chest, each beat louder than the last. The truth was out there, buried in the pages of the files he had just discovered. His sons hadn't just been taken by the government. They had been subjected to something much worse, something more insidious than he had ever imagined. Now that he had the proof, he couldn't stop. He couldn't let it end here. Mark moved quickly through the town, his mind spinning as he walked toward his car. His thoughts raced faster than his feet could carry him. He had the files. He had everything he needed to expose the truth, the photographs, the reports, the names of the officials involved in the forced assimilation program, all hidden in plain sight. But now he had to make sure it would reach the right people. He couldn't let this discovery go unnoticed. He had to act fast before anyone else could sweep it all under the rug. But he didn't know where to start. Who would listen to him? Would they even believe him? The government had spent decades hiding these atrocities, covering up their dark history, and Mark feared they might try to silence him too, but that was a risk he was willing to take. Mark's first stop was a local newspaper in the town, a small, independent outlet that had reported on Native American issues in the past. He had heard of them before. They were brave and had a reputation for challenging the status quo. If anyone would take his story seriously, it was them. Mark walked into the office with the files in hand, his mind made up. He wouldn't back down now. He was greeted by a young woman behind the counter who looked up in surprise when Mark approached. "Can I help you?" she asked. Mark's voice was firm but trembling with emotion as he spoke. "I need to speak with your editor. It's important." She studied him for a moment, then nodded and pointed down the hall. "He's in his office. Just go ahead in." Mark didn't waste a moment. He walked toward the editor's office, the weight of the files feeling like lead in his hands. The door was slightly ajar, and he could hear the muffled sound of someone typing away at a keyboard. He knocked gently, then pushed the door open. Inside, an older man with glasses looked up, his expression one of polite curiosity. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice friendly but cautious. Mark didn't waste time on pleasantries. He placed the files on the desk, watching the editor's eyes widen as he saw the documents. The man hesitated before looking up at Mark. "What is this?" Mark's voice was steady, though it carried an undercurrent of raw emotion. "This is the story of my sons. They were taken by the government in 1942, and the truth behind their disappearance is far darker than anyone ever knew. These documents show everything: the experiments they were subjected to, the system that used them, and the officials who were involved. I need you to help me expose it." The editor sat back, his expression shifting from curiosity to concern. He glanced down at the files, then back up at Mark. This is a lot. If what you're saying is true, it could change everything. But do you understand the danger? There are people in power who will stop at nothing to keep this quiet. You could be putting yourself at risk by even bringing this to me." Mark nodded, his eyes unwavering. "I've spent 35 years looking for my sons. I can't let them remain hidden in the shadows. The truth needs to come out. If no one else is going to do something, then I will." The editor looked at the files for a long time, clearly weighing the decision. Finally, he pushed the papers aside and nodded. "I'll run the story, but it's going to take time, Mark. We need to verify everything, and we have to make sure we have the proper evidence. I'm with you, but we have to be careful." Mark felt a wave of relief wash over him. For the first time in years, he felt like there was a glimmer of hope. The story was finally going to be heard. The truth about his sons, about the suffering of so many Native American children, was going to be exposed. Over the next few weeks, Mark worked tirelessly with the newspaper's staff, helping them gather more evidence, speaking to other survivors, and tracking down anyone who might know the full extent of what had happened in the government-run institutions. The story began to take shape, and Mark could feel the weight of the truth building, ready to break free. But with each passing day, the danger increased. The deeper they dug, the more powerful the people who wanted to keep this hidden became. Mark received multiple anonymous threats, warnings that he should stop, that he should leave it alone. But he refused. He wasn't afraid. Not anymore. He couldn't live with the knowledge that he had allowed the truth to be buried again. His sons, Matthew, Luke, and Sam, had been victims of a system that had tried to erase them, and he wasn't going to let that happen. The newspaper began preparing the story for publication, and Mark knew that the moment it hit the press, there would be no going back. The system would fight back, but Mark was ready. He would not be silenced. The night before the story was scheduled to run, Mark sat alone in his small cabin, the weight of the coming storm pressing on his chest. He had done everything he could. He had uncovered the truth, he had gathered the evidence, and he had brought it to light. He thought of his sons, wherever they were, and he knew that tomorrow would change everything. Tomorrow, the world would know what had happened to them. The next morning, the newspaper hit the stands, the headline screaming the truth. Native American children used in government experiments. The Miller family reveals hidden truth. Mark stood at the counter of the local store, his hands shaking as he grabbed a copy of the newspaper. He felt a sense of pride, but also a deep sadness. The truth had come at a high price. The fight wasn't over yet. In fact, it was just beginning. But for the first time in 35 years, Mark knew that the search for his sons, for the truth, had been worth it. The world would finally know what had been done to them, and to the countless other children who had suffered the same fate. Mark stood at the edge of the town's small square, the fresh morning sun shining down on him. But the weight of the day ahead was heavy. His heart was pounding, and his hands trembled as he held a copy of the newspaper. He had never imagined that something as simple as a headline could carry so much power. But now that the truth was out, he knew it wasn't going to be an easy road ahead. The story of the government's exploitation of Native children was out in the open. The newspaper article had ignited a firestorm. Within hours of publication, the small town where Mark lived had buzzed with talk. It spread across the neighboring cities, and soon the nation was beginning to take notice. People were shocked, outraged. But as much as the truth was needed, the backlash had already begun. Mark had known it would come, but nothing could have prepared him for the dangerous force that was about to turn against him. By midday, Mark had already received a dozen anonymous threats, each more terrifying than the last. He could feel the tension in the air, and every time someone knocked on his door, his heart would race, wondering if it would be another person trying to silence him. The government officials who had been involved in the program had powerful allies. They controlled so much of what was seen and heard in the public sphere. Now that Mark had exposed their crimes, they would stop at nothing to discredit him, to erase the story. A call came in later that afternoon, just as Mark was starting to feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. The voice on the other end was cold, emotionless. "You don't know what you've done," the voice said. "You've opened a door that should have stayed closed. We're watching you, Miller. If you don't stop this now, you won't like what comes next." Mark felt a chill run down his spine, but he knew he couldn't back down now. This was the moment he had been working toward for 35 years. The truth was more important than the fear he was beginning to feel. The next few days were a blur. The government started to put pressure on the newspaper, calling the article a hoax and demanding a retraction. But the editor, who had worked with Mark to bring the story to light, refused. The more the paper was attacked, the more Mark realized how deep the conspiracy went. They weren't just trying to silence him. They were trying to bury the truth once and for all. Mark knew he had to act fast. The longer he waited, the greater the risk that everything he had worked for would be undone. He contacted other survivors, people who had been through the same horrors his sons had suffered. Some of them were willing to speak out, but many were afraid, hesitant to risk their own safety. They knew that the people Mark was up against had the power to destroy lives, but Mark wasn't afraid anymore. He had seen the truth, and now it was his mission to make sure the world knew. Mark reached out to lawyers, people who could help him navigate the complex legal system and ensure the right people were held accountable. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he couldn't stop now. This was bigger than him. This was about every family whose children had been taken and abused by a system that pretended to be doing good. The following week, Mark found himself sitting in a small law office, the air thick with uncertainty. The lawyer across from him was a young woman named Margaret, who had agreed to take on his case after reading the article. She was passionate and determined, but she was also aware of the immense challenge ahead of them. "They're going to fight this, Mark," Margaret said, her voice steady but firm. "The system is going to push back with everything it has. You've exposed something big, something they've kept hidden for decades. The government won't let this slide. It's going to be dangerous." Mark nodded, the reality of the situation sinking in. He could feel the heaviness of the path ahead. The road to justice wasn't going to be easy, and it might take years to bring the truth to light fully. But Mark wasn't going to stop. He couldn't stop. Margaret continued. "We'll start by gathering more survivors, more evidence. We'll need to prove that what happened wasn't just a mistake or a bad policy. It was deliberate. It was abuse." Mark clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. "I don't care how long it takes. I will bring the truth to light. I will bring my sons back. Even if they're not physically here, I owe them that much." The next few months were filled with endless meetings, phone calls, and back and forth with authorities. Mark faced increasing resistance, but the momentum of the public outcry was on his side. Slowly but surely, support began to grow. Activists, native leaders, and even some former government workers came forward to speak the truth. The story was picking up steam, and Mark could feel the weight of his fight shifting in his favor. But the real battle had only just begun. The government wasn't going to let go of its secrets so easily. Mark was constantly harassed by anonymous calls, threats, and even physical intimidation. He received more deadly warnings, the kind that chilled his blood. But each time he received one, he grew stronger. The more they tried to scare him into silence, the more determined he became. And then, one fateful night, Mark received a call from Margaret. Her voice was serious, urgent. "They're moving fast on this, Mark. We have a court date. We need to be ready. But we're going to need all the support we can get. If we're going to win this, we need the truth to be heard, loud and clear. And we need to get people on our side, people with power, people who can help." Mark's heart raced. This was it. The moment he had been working for was finally here. Mark stood at the edge of the courthouse, his heart beating faster with every passing moment. This was it. After 35 years of searching, of fighting against a system that had worked to bury the truth, he was about to stand before the world and tell the story of his sons. He had the evidence. He had the documents, the witnesses, and the support of people who were finally willing to speak out. The moment he had waited for had arrived, but with it came the tension that had been building for years. As he entered the courtroom, Mark's nerves were on edge. The weight of the case pressed on him. He knew that what was about to happen would shape not only the future for his sons, but for countless others who had suffered in silence, their stories buried under the guise of government policy. His sons had been victims, but so many others had been taken as well. This wasn't just about his family, it was about truth, justice, and the fight to reclaim lost identities. The courtroom was packed. The walls felt as if they were closing in, but Mark stood tall, determined. The press filled the seats, eager for what was about to unfold. In the gallery, Mark saw some familiar faces, people who had come forward after the article had been published, survivors who had been through the same pain, the same loss. They were all there to lend their voices to his cause. Across from him, seated at the defense table, were the government lawyers. Their suits were pristine, their demeanor cold and professional, as if nothing they had done was out of the ordinary. They were confident, as they always had been, that they could shut down this case before it even gained real traction. But Mark knew better now. He had the truth on his side, and the truth was powerful. As the proceedings began, Mark's lawyer, Margaret, stood and addressed the court. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice steady and clear, "today we stand before you to seek justice for the victims of a system that has systematically destroyed the lives of children in the name of assimilation. For decades, Native American children were taken from their homes, stripped of their culture, and subjected to experimentation under the guise of education. And this isn't just a story of one family. It's the story of thousands. It's a story that we can no longer ignore. Today, we seek the truth. Today, we seek accountability." Mark could feel the weight of her words. They were the words he had wanted to hear for so long, the words that echoed in his own heart. It was his time now. He was about to speak the truth. The first witness called was Mark Miller himself. He took the stand, his heart pounding, but his voice unwavering. As he spoke, he recounted the years of grief, the agonizing silence, and the endless search for his sons. His words were raw, but they were filled with the strength of a father who had never stopped looking. "The government took my sons, and for 35 years I have asked myself why. Why were they taken? Why were they forced into this program? Why were they never allowed to come home?" Mark's voice broke, but he quickly regained his composure. "I searched for them, but no one would help. No one would give me answers. But now I stand here before you with the truth. I found them. My sons were used, manipulated, and subjected to experiments that stripped them of their heritage, of who they were. They were taken from me, and they were taken from everyone like me. This wasn't education. This was assimilation. This was exploitation. This was abuse." Mark paused, allowing his words to settle in the room. The courtroom was silent, the jury listening intently. For the first time, the truth was out there, no longer hidden behind bureaucratic walls. Next, the defense team attempted to discredit Mark, questioning his credibility and trying to paint the government's actions as a well-intentioned effort to improve the lives of Native children. But Mark had already anticipated this. He had come prepared, not just with his own testimony, but with witnesses, survivors who had lived through the same horrors. One of the most powerful moments of the trial came when Lena, a woman in her early 50s, took the stand. She had been taken from her family when she was only 10 years old. She spoke with a quiet strength, her eyes filled with emotion as she recounted her time in the boarding school. "They told us it was for our own good," Lena said, her voice steady but filled with pain. "But all they did was take away everything, our language, our traditions, our culture. They tried to make us forget who we were. We were nothing to them but experiments. My story is just one of many. There are so many like me. I wasn't the only one they took, and I won't be the last." Mark watched as Lena spoke. Her words were a wake-up call, not just for the court, but for the entire nation. It was no longer a story of a few missing children. It was the story of a generation, a systematic erasure of an entire people's history. The defense tried to counter with their own witnesses, but they were no match for the strength of the survivors' testimony. As the trial wore on, it became clear that the truth was winning. The jury listened carefully to the evidence presented by Mark's team, and as the closing arguments approached, Mark knew that this was his chance. This was the moment when the world would finally see the extent of the government's betrayal. In the final moments of the trial, Margaret turned to the jury and said, "This case isn't just about righting the wrongs done to one family. It's about righting the wrongs done to an entire generation. It's about acknowledging the pain and suffering that has been buried for far too long. The government can't keep hiding from its actions. The truth is out. The victims of this program deserve justice, and we ask you to deliver that justice by holding the responsible parties accountable." As the jury deliberated, Mark couldn't help but feel a sense of relief and dread all at once. He had spent his entire life searching for answers, for the truth. And now, after everything, the moment of reckoning had arrived. The jury took their time, carefully considering the evidence, the testimonies, and the weight of the case. Mark sat in silence, his thoughts a mix of hope and fear. He knew that justice was not guaranteed, but he couldn't help but believe that after so many years, they were finally on the verge of victory. The final days of the trial stretched on like a drawn-out nightmare. Mark couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped between two worlds, the world he knew, the world of his sons, and the cold, unforgiving world of powerful forces determined to silence him. His eyes often drifted to the jury, watching their every movement, hoping for a sign. But the truth was clearer than ever. This wasn't just about the government's wrongdoings. It was about exposing a system of abuse that had hurt so many others besides Mark and his sons. The courtroom was full that final morning. The tension in the air was palpable, every person present understanding the magnitude of what was about to unfold. The moment Mark had waited for, the moment of truth, was upon him. Mark couldn't help but replay the journey in his mind, the moments of grief, the years of searching, the painful discoveries, the people he had met along the way. His sons weren't just lost to him anymore. They were part of a bigger story, a dark chapter in the history of this country. Their lives were not only stolen from him, they were stolen from an entire community, an entire people. Margaret, his lawyer, had worked tirelessly, presenting witness after witness, unraveling the web of deceit. The defense had tried to refute the allegations, attempting to paint the government's actions as well-intentioned, but they had failed. Each witness who stepped forward, Lena, the other survivors, had chipped away at the lies until all that remained was the undeniable truth. The system had used children, had exploited them in the name of education, only to bury their stories, to erase their culture. Now it was time for Mark to speak one last time, the last closing argument before the jury would deliberate. This would be the moment he had spent 35 years preparing for, the moment when he could finally say to the world, "This is my truth. This is the truth of my sons." Mark stood before the jury, his heart heavy, but his voice strong. He had come to understand that this wasn't just about his sons. It was about everyone who had been affected by the policies of forced assimilation. It was about the families who had lost their children, the children who had lost their identities. "We have heard the stories," Mark began, his voice steady. "We have heard the pain of those who were taken, stripped of their culture, their heritage, and their voice. And we have heard the truth that my sons, like so many others, were victims of a government system designed not to educate, but to erase them." Mark's gaze never wavered as he looked at the jury, his words cutting through the silence. "For years, my family has carried the burden of not knowing what happened to my sons. For years we have suffered in silence, waiting for someone to tell us the truth. But now you know the truth. Now the world knows." He paused, his hands trembling slightly as he held up a photograph, the one that had started it all. The photograph of his sons standing together, smiling in the boarding school. He had carried that photograph with him every day, the one piece of his sons he could hold on to. This photograph was taken in 1945, 3 years after they were taken from me. They were still alive, still children, but they were subjected to a system that treated them like experiments, not children. Mark's voice broke for just a moment, but he steadied himself. "I am here to tell you the truth and to ask for justice. I am here to ask you to stand with me, with my sons, and with every child who suffered in silence. I ask you to hold the people responsible accountable and to make sure that no other child ever has to suffer like mine did." He set the photograph down, his hands now clenched into fists. "The government took my sons. They took them from their home, from their culture, from their family. They tried to break them, to make them forget who they were, but they couldn't. My sons, they are not lost. They are not gone. They are part of this story, a story that must be told. I am their voice now, and I will never stop until the truth is heard." The courtroom was silent as Mark finished speaking. His words hung in the air, a final plea for justice and accountability. The defense remained seated, their faces cold, unwilling to acknowledge the weight of Mark's words. But Mark didn't need their acknowledgement. He had already done what he set out to do. He had given his sons a voice. The jury deliberated for what felt like an eternity. Mark sat in the quiet, the weight of the trial settling in his bones. He thought of his sons, of Matthew, the oldest, who had always been the protector, of Luke, whose quick wit had always made Mark laugh, of Sam, the youngest, whose innocence had been the hardest to lose. He thought of the years they had spent apart, and the countless days he had spent wondering where they were, what had happened to them. And then, after what felt like an endless wait, the jury returned. Mark stood as the foreman of the jury stood up, holding a piece of paper in his hand. Mark's heart thudded in his chest. The foreman spoke. "We, the jury, find the defendants guilty of gross misconduct and violations of Native American children's rights. The government is responsible for the suffering inflicted upon Mark Miller's sons and the other children involved in the program." Mark's breath caught in his throat. It was happening. The truth was finally recognized. We also find that reparations are owed to the families affected by this program, and that the government must publicly acknowledge the damage it has caused and work toward healing the damage done. Mark stood still, his mind racing. He had won. Justice had been served, not just for his sons, but for all the children who had been stolen, for the families who had been destroyed. The battle wasn't over yet. There was still much to be done, but Mark had finally found peace. His son's memory would live on. Their story would never be erased again. As Mark left the courtroom, a sense of calm washed over him. The years of uncertainty, the years of heartache were behind him. His sons were no longer just memories. They were part of a larger story, one that would change the future for generations to come. The truth had been exposed, and Mark, finally, could let go of the weight he had carried for so long. The days following the verdict were a whirlwind. News outlets from across the country swarmed to cover the historic decision, the headline echoing in every corner of the nation. Government found guilty in forced assimilation of Native children. The victory felt surreal to Mark. The long, painful journey to uncover the truth was now complete, but the emotions still surged within him: joy, relief, grief, and a sense of finality. Mark had spent 35 years searching for answers, and in the end, it wasn't just about finding his sons. It was about finding the truth that had been hidden for so long, and about bringing accountability to the people who had tried to erase his family's story and the stories of so many others. But as he sat at his kitchen table, looking over the stacks of papers and official statements, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to do. The case had been won in the courtroom, but the work was far from over. Reparations were promised, but they were only the beginning. The damage done to the children who had been forced into the assimilation system couldn't be undone with a few legal victories. Mark knew that his sons, Matthew, Luke, and Sam, were never coming home. He had spent so many years wondering if they were alive, if they were lost, or if they were simply gone forever. The truth, however painful, had given him the clarity he had sought all those years, but it also left a gaping hole in his heart. They had been taken, and now he knew how much they had suffered. The guilt of not being able to protect them was something he would carry for the rest of his life. The media circus that followed the verdict was overwhelming. Mark had always known that the truth would spark controversy, but he hadn't fully prepared himself for the public attention. People from all walks of life reached out to him, some in support, others still denying the magnitude of the government's actions. He was offered interviews, television appearances, and public forums to speak about his victory, but he politely declined. Mark didn't need fame, he didn't need recognition. He needed the healing that only time and reflection could bring. He began to spend more time on the reservation, back in the land that had always been his home, the place where he had raised his children, where his sons had played in the fields. There, Mark could breathe easier. The land was silent, as if it understood the gravity of the battle that had taken place. He sat by the river often, watching the flowing waters, the place where his sons had once played. It was peaceful, but the memories still haunted him. A year after the trial, Mark received a letter. It was from Lena, one of the survivors who had testified in court. She had become a close ally in the fight for justice, and her own story had touched Mark deeply. The letter was handwritten, a simple note that read, "Mark, we are finally free. The truth is out. My family is healing, and I know yours is too. But I wanted to share something with you. I found something that could change everything for us. I found others like us. More children, more survivors who were hidden away. There are more stories to tell. Will you help me share them?" Mark felt a sudden rush of emotion as he read the letter. There was more to be done, more survivors, more stories that needed to be told. The fight for justice wasn't over. He had found justice for his sons, but the truth was bigger than just his family. There were still so many whose voices had been silenced. Mark knew that his work had only just begun. The next few months were spent in intense collaboration with Lena and other survivors. Mark began to speak publicly, not just about his sons, but about the system that had harmed them. He traveled to different reservations, meeting with families whose children had been taken, and helping them share their own stories. The government had taken so much from them, but it couldn't take away their voices. Mark became a leader in the movement for reparations, not just for his family, but for all the families whose children had been stolen. He knew that it would take years to repair the damage done, but he also knew that he was not alone anymore. He was part of something bigger than his own grief, bigger than his own story. The fight for justice was ongoing, and Mark was ready to see it through to the end. His sons, Matthew, Luke, and Sam, would not be forgotten. They had not been erased. They were part of a legacy of resistance, survival, and truth. Mark's final victory was not in the courtroom. It was not in the headlines or the legal battles. It was in the moment when he realized that his sons' spirits would live on, not just in the pages of history, but in the hearts of the people they had inspired. He had brought the truth to light, and now it was up to others to carry it forward. Mark Miller had given everything to find his sons, but in the end, what he found was far greater, a movement that would change the future for generations to come. As Mark stood at the edge of the river, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. The water flowed endlessly, just as time did, and in that moment he knew that his sons were finally free from the system that had tried to break them, free from the silence that had haunted his family for so long. Mark looked up at the sky, his voice a whisper in the wind. "You're free now, my sons. And so am I."